Hello, welcome to a short revision video looking at the concept of absolute poverty. So what is absolute poverty, also known as extreme poverty? Well, absolute poverty is when a household, people living in a household, do not have enough income to sustain even a basic acceptable standard of living, and they don't have enough economic resources to meet people's essential core needs. Absolute poverty is also known as extreme poverty, and the World Bank defines poverty in absolute terms. They have a series of poverty lines. You may well have come across these, including the number of people or the percentage of the population living on less than $1.90 per day PPP. In fact, there are now 3 absolute poverty, extreme poverty thresholds. They do vary between developed and developing emerging countries. So the first one is the percentage of the population living below $1.90 a day PPP. Quick reminder, PPP is an attempt to adjust the data to take into account differences in the cost of living between countries, using hopefully a fairly standardized basket of goods and services. There's also a $3.20 a day threshold and a $5.50 a day threshold. Now, our focus here is going to be on income, but please bear in mind, particularly from an evaluation point of view, that extreme poverty is multi-dimensional. It's about much more than surviving on an extremely low income per capita. The World Bank's group goals are actually to end extreme poverty. Bringing this down is the first of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we'll look at some of the data in terms of progress meeting that goal in a second or two. Which countries in the world have the lowest per capita incomes? Well, there's a big discrepancy, of course, between population size and the share of global GDP. In some countries, per capita GDP is extremely low. I was reading that in 2017, according again to the World Bank, the lowest income countries contributed less than 1% of global GDP in PPP terms, but they have nearly 8% of the world's population. Burundi, according to the latest HDI data, is the country with the lowest per capita income in the world, PPP adjusted. This table confirms this. Gross national income, GNI, per capita of only $750 in real terms. So here are the countries in the world with the lowest GNI per capita. Central African Republic comes second. In fact, there are 2 countries still with a GNI per capita of less than $1,000 a year. And I've put the life expectancy data in there as well for a point of comparison and contrast. Which countries in the world have the highest percentage of population living in extreme poverty? Well, in Madagascar, unfortunately comes top of this list. In that country, many people, of course, live in rural areas. Over 3/4 of the population live on less than $1.90 a day. Here's the data. DRC is second, Burundi 71.8%, and then I've put in some other countries by way of, again, of contrast. Even fast-growing countries like Rwanda still have exceptionally high percentage of population living on less than $1.90 a day. In other words, in these countries, more than half the population is on that metric of extreme poverty. Now, this data groups countries into regions, and you can see for developing countries as a whole, around 1 person in 6 lives in absolute poverty using the $1.90 a day threshold. But you could also see that absolute poverty is much more concentrated in Sub-Saharan Africa, 45.7%. I do want to recommend those of you who get into this topic, and many do, as part of their studies into development economics, I want to recommend the website Our World in Data, a truly superb, tremendously enriching site, which is just a superb source of evidence, in particular for progress made in reducing poverty. So this chart, this graphic, shows the percentage of people living in extreme poverty on the $1.90 a day measure against their GDP per capita in 2011 constant international dollars. What are the trends? What are the movements in absolute poverty in the world economy. Well, the good news is that according to the data, extreme poverty has been in decline, although perhaps not fast enough to meet one of the main Sustainable Development Goals, which is bringing down extreme poverty to less than 3% of the population by 2030. The global extreme poverty rate did fall below 10%, I think, in 2017. And the number of people, so it actually was 8.6% in 2018, according to this chart. That was down from about 11% 5 years earlier. And the number of people on the right-hand side living on less than $1.90 a day has also fallen during this period. I think the latest figures I had in 2018, it fell by another 68 million to about 735 million people. So there has been progress. We know that poverty evolves as countries grow and develop, and so in many of these countries, growth has exceeded population growth, GDP rising at a faster rate than population, lifting per capita incomes, and therefore bringing down extreme poverty. This chart shows the number of poor by region, and extreme poverty has declined dramatically in East Asia and the Pacific, as you can see, and that's a reflection of the progress in lifting per capita incomes in China in particular. Now here is the extreme poverty rate shown by country. The dark blue areas, the darkest shaded areas, have a poverty rate in excess of 40%. Half of the nations within Sub-Saharan Africa have poverty rates higher than 35%. And globally, 4 out of 5 people below that $1.90 a day measure live in rural areas. And about 130 million of the global poor live in areas with high flood risk. Now, the reality is that millions of the poorest people on the planet live in countries and locations most at risk from the impact of man-made climate change, including flood risk. And I think, again, looking at the World Bank poverty reports, something like 3/4 of all the large cities are located on coasts. Therefore, urban floods become an ever-increasing risk. By 2050, nearly 1/5 of the world's population will be at risk of floods. The concentration of extreme poverty is shown by this chart, which takes us down within Sub-Saharan Africa. Almost half of the poor people in Sub-Saharan Africa live in just 5 countries, including Nigeria, the DRC and Tanzania. Now here's the data for what the World Bank calls sort of moderate absolute poverty. That's the percentage of the population living on less than $3.20 a day and $5.50 a day, PPP adjusted. Clearly, as you raise the threshold, more people are counted as living in absolute poverty, and progress in bringing down the poverty rates is clear all the way through to 2018. Although the number of poor, again, that's come down, but keep in mind also many of these countries' population growth is quite strong. So the relative reduction in the number of people in extreme poverty by these metrics is slower. So the last 2 decades have seen, I think, significant progress in bringing down absolute extreme poverty in many of the world's poorest countries. The extreme poverty rate has come down. Child mortality has declined from nearly 14% to 7%. Access to electricity has increased by 57%. The share of people using at least basic safe drinking water and sanitation has increased by about 1/5 and 40% respectively. However, the forecast is that global extreme poverty is expected to go up in 2020 and 2021 for the first time in 2 decades. Of course, that's partly the impact of the disruption caused by COVID-19, as well as residual risks, conflict and climate change. The World Bank is saying that COVID-19 could push more than 100 million people back into extreme poverty using their income thresholds. And that's the biggest setback in poverty reduction for a generation. impact of COVID-19 obviously on economic activity, on GDP, on people's earnings, on savings, on the impact on nutritional deprivation, lost schooling, for example. There are lots of negatives which are challenging the impact on poverty. So 2020 is likely to have seen the first reversal in the fight against extreme poverty in a generation. Here's the data for Sub-Saharan Africa using various baseline forecasts that the number of people in extreme poverty is going to rise quite sharply. And of course we know that pandemics in developed and developing countries, in high and low income countries, pandemics harm typically the poor and the vulnerable the most. And that is the reality facing many people. In our next video, we're going to take again a data-driven look at the concept of relative poverty.